Hi there, Alucard J here, and this is a video response to a question I was asked. So I think it's easier if I explain it through video than trying to type all this out. Okay, so here's the problem I've been presented. When the player goes through trigger B collider, trigger B will activate trigger A and then destroy itself. Now when the player is passing through trigger A, I assume after it's been activated, a monster pops up and then trigger A is destroyed with the monster when the player leaves trigger A. Now first with this example script that I was sent, biggest problem with using set active is it doesn't work for triggers. So if your game object is not active, the triggers will still work, unfortunately. Now I can't remember where I read this and I can't show you where I can back it up, but if you do some tests for yourself, you'll see this is what's happening. So if this game object is disabled, these trigger events will still happen. So you can't quite use setting a trigger collider as active or not. You need to set up a boolean that's going to remember that and look after it for you. So let's just try and create this whole project. So this is where I do all my answers. That's why there's heaps of folders, but I've got a folder here with multiple triggers and a new blank scene. So let's set it up. Let's create a cube, name it a floor, 0 out of position, and give it a floor type scale. Okay, we'll give it a floor texture somewhere. Flourish enough. Create directional light. Move that right up out of the way. Okay, so let's create our trigger volumes. So let's create a cube. Let's name it trigger underscore A. Okay, let's just zero everything out. That's better. Okay, so trigger A will give it a green material, transparent. Set the scale. Okay, so that's trigger A. Now let's make trigger B. And trigger B look different. Transparent red. Make this wider. Okay, so got our two trigger zones set up. See that clear? No, you can't. Okay, let's bring in first person controller so we can walk around and activate these triggers. So delete the main camera. Controller. Wherever that's gone. Okay, so I should be able to hit play, walk around, and of course these are triggers. So trigger A and B, set the box collider to trigger. Okay, so there we are. So now we've got the level set up, let's build some scripts to make all this happen. Multiple triggers, create a JavaScript, we'll create one for trigger A. Also create JavaScript for trigger B. Okay, so let's look at the problem again. When the player goes through trigger B collider, trigger B will activate trigger A. So let's start with trigger B script. Okay. on trigger enter. Trigger enter, it takes a parameter of the collider of the other game object that it hit. That compiles. Let's put our scripts on. Trigger A onto trigger A, trigger B onto trigger B. They've seen. Now back to the scripts. Let's just start with a good old debug. Game object dot name. Okay, so on the B script, trigger B is the red one. So when we enter trigger B, we should get a message. We'll leave it, enter it. Okay, so the trigger events are starting to happen. Let's put that on trigger A2. Okay, back to the problem. When player goes through trigger B collider, trigger B activates trigger A and destroys trigger B. So let's set up a boolean. Is activated. Boolean equals. It's going to be true for trigger B. So on trigger enter, the player enters. So if I'm going to check is activated, and after that, I'm going to check if it's the player that's activated the trigger. Copy all this. Other game object name is equal to player. So we better name our player player. Okay, save the scene. So now if the player enters that trigger, we'll get the message. And looks like A is working too. Okay, so back to the problem. Once the player goes through trigger B once, it deactivates. So let's set that up. So, equals false. So this is a one-hit kind of thing. Once this trigger B object becomes deactivated through the boolean, then it's not going to do this again. So we should only get the message once. Player, trigger. Now B is only, now if we look at trigger B, we have a boolean there, is activated, is now false. So it's true on start, go through, it becomes false. It doesn't become true again. Okay, so we've got the first part working. Destroy trigger B and activate trigger A. So trigger B is going to need a reference to trigger A. Okay. So first we're going to activate trigger A, and do that there, and then we're going to deactivate trigger B. So how are we going to activate trigger A? Well, we can just send message to the game object. So let's just do that. So we need to set up a function. It's called trigger A. Set to active and pass it a boolean. So we're going to need this is activated variable too. Alright. And we start default false on this one. Set active the value. So is activated equals the value. So we can send a message to this script, say set to active true. It's going to set is active to true, or set to active false. Is active will become false. So I want to call that from trigger B. So activate trigger. Okay, so got the game object. Dot send message, and it's set to active, and we're going to set this to true because we're activating it. Send message options require, because it should have a receiver, so we want it to break if it doesn't have a receiver to let us know. Okay, so trigger B. If the player enters trigger B, it's active and it's player. We're going to activate trigger A. We're going to call that function and set it to true. And we're going to deactivate this script. Okay, so trigger B, trigger A. We'll watch this. As we enter the red trigger collider, trigger A, the green collider, should become set to active. Okay, and what have I not done? I haven't assigned it in the script. Trigger A, empty game object. Drag that in. Save the scene. Now watching trigger A to become active when we hit the red one. And there we go. Nothing changes and we don't get that B trigger message because trigger B has become deactivated. Okay, so where are we in the problem? Go through trigger B activates trigger A and stops trigger B from working. Okay, now when we're passing through trigger A monster pops up. And when the player leaves that area, the monster and the trigger becomes deactivated. Alright, so we have it on trigger enter. We're also going to have it on trigger exit. Okay, so we want to check, same as last time, if is activated. We want to check if the game object name is equal to player. Happened to all my spacing. Okay, so if this is activated and the player set it off on the enter, we want to show monster. And I'll create another function just like I did set to active. Show monster. So I better quickly create a monster object, hadn't I? Monster game object. Monster.renderer.enabled equals the value. So the start, we want to show monster set to false. Alright, let's just quickly add this monster. Let's move this trigger a little further away. Okay, so let's just create a cylinder. It can be our monster. Okay, so that is going to be our stand-in monster. Trigger A monster game object. Save the scene. So when I hit play, the monster should be deactivated. So we enter the trigger. This trigger. We're hitting the monster. Okay, on trigger is activated. Game object names are lowercase. Gotta watch your spelling. We show monster is true. Now on exit, if it's activated, false. Alright, so I've just been typing all this away, so let's explain what's going on. So, trigger B has a reference to trigger A game object, and it starts being active. So if the player enters the trigger, or if anything enters the trigger checks, am I activated? Yes. Has the player just walked through the trigger? Yes. Okay, so we'll say the trigger A, send a message set to active, and the boolean of true, and then we're going to deactivate this game object. So this trigger is only ever going to work once. Okay, so we go over to trigger A, and we check set to active. Activated becomes true here. So now if the trigger is entered on trigger A, checks if it's active, then we check if it was the player that walked through. If the player did walk into the trigger, let's show the monster. Okay, so when this trigger is exited, we'll check again if we're activated, and then we check if it was the player, and then we'll hide the monster, and then we'll deactivate this. So basically this whole pop scare is only going to happen once. So let's hit play. Now first of all, if I walk straight to the green collider, nothing should happen here. Okay, nothing's happening. It's not active. So I walk through the red one. The green one should now be active. So if I walk into the green one, there's our monster. Whoa! So I run away. He's disappeared. Now if I walk through that again, it's not happening. And even if I try and walk through this one, try and make it all happen again, it's not happening. Okay, so just a final look at those two scripts. Pause it, copy the script. Of course you don't need debugs once you've got it all working. Okay, so that's trigger B's script, and now trigger A's script. Now scroll down. The same thing with the debugs, you probably don't want them once you've got it working. And that's it. So I hope it helps out Projecto Terra, the fellow that asked me the question. I hope that really gets that problem sorted for you. Okay, thanks for watching.